Welcome to my channel. Today I want to answer your questions and talk about the amazing benefits of negative painting technique, showing you some concrete examples of how it can truly enhance your watercolor work and allow you to create beautiful effects that you may be trying to achieve in your work, but perhaps you're not sure about the mechanics or the actual steps of getting where you want to go. Negative painting is a method of painting an object without filling it with color. Instead, you're applying the pigment around your object. The focus is on the area outside of the shape rather than on the inside of the shape, and it's particularly suitable for watercolor due to the translucency of this medium. And although it may sound counterintuitive, I promise you it's just a matter of following a few easy steps and understanding where exactly this technique is most beneficial, which is what I will show you in a minute, and it is absolutely amazing if you want to improve the following things. Number one, add beautiful backgrounds to your watercolor images with lots of visual interest. Number two, if you want to create smooth edges without paint leaking from one object to another or having to leave unnecessary white space between objects. If you want to paint the finest details without having to use messy masking fluid. If you want to create a better sense of light by adjusting watercolor temperature from warm to cold and from cold to warm. And of course, if you want to create better contrast by changing values and playing with light and dark in your work. So follow along and I will explain step by step using the small botanical illustration I did last week. The reference photo, if you want to practice, can be found on unsplash.com. It's an excellent resource of royalty-free images, and I will link the image below in the video description. And my full list of materials is also in the video description below. As always, the most important thing is to have 100% cotton watercolor paper that will withstand multiple washes of color. I'm using Arches cold pressed, 140 pounds. If you can work with 300, even better. In terms of the pigments, I will be naming the ones I use, but feel free to use whatever brand you have on hand. We'll be using lots of oranges and greens and a little bit of blue. So let's get started by creating a very light background. I will cover the entire surface of my paper with water and then drop very light pigments, letting them sort of mingle and blend on paper. This is called a wet on wet technique, and it will give us our first layer of color without any harsh edges, just simply identifying some warmer orange areas where the flowers will go, and then the greenery around. I'm using mostly very warm greens right now. You don't need to use such a variety, just a basic hooker's green throughout with splashes of lighter green gold on those larger leaves facing the sun, and maybe a bit of olive green all the way at the bottom to start adding a sense of depth and some variation in color, some visual interest. For orange flowers, it's a mixture of Hansa Yellow Deep and some Pyrrole Orange. The negative painting will follow in step 2, but during this preparation stage, I want you to notice two things. Number one, I didn't leave my flowers blank, but instead blended my oranges with greens. The trick here is to add a bit more orange than you think you need, sort of letting it go outside of the boundary of the flower. And as long as your overall colors are very light, this will ensure that the green doesn't come into the flower area. That would muddy up the flower. On the other hand, having orange come out into the green won't interfere as much because we will cover it with more green later on. In fact, it will help us create a nice sense of glow around each flower. You will see the result in just a minute. It's subtle but really wonderful. Number 2, notice the areas where I have outlined my green leaves with a pencil before I started painting. This plant has very distinct round leaves, sort of like plates or umbrellas, and they're facing the sun typically. And in those areas, I dropped some green gold. This is important as it will give us some nice variation and a good start for the overall color scheme on those leaves. And it will help us distinguish between the foreground leaves that are facing the source of light and our darker background greenery later on when we do negative painting. Okay, layer number 1 is done. Let this dry completely, at least 2 hours. I actually came back in 6 hours and started working on the second layer, which is the actual negative painting. So watch closely. This is my favorite part because in just a few minutes, this entire flat surface of our paper will be transformed as I'm working with my cold Perylene Green from Daniel Smith, slowly going around the leaves that I have outlined with my pencil and also around the flowers. Notice too that I'm going around the stems. In some cases, I don't even have an outline of a stem. I just sort of create these thin stems by painting around them. If I didn't have any color underneath, I would have to come back with a very fine brush and try to fill them in with color. But because I'm painting around them, they emerge full of lighter green color, the background color that we put down on our first layer. And they don't even need any more work. The border between light and dark green is perfectly clean. It's like magic, honestly. I love it. There's no need to worry about smooth edges. Your edges are smooth by definition, or more accurately, there is no edge at all to worry about. This is why negative painting is so useful, because it eliminates that stressful part of painting something so small and worrying about the accuracy of your brush. You simply paint around your shape or around your object, and assuming there's some color underneath, it sort of pops. And I do get a lot of questions about smooth edges and how to ensure that they're always accurate. And so aside from having good watercolor paper that doesn't allow color bleeds, using a fine brush tip, and of course ensuring that your paints dry completely before you paint next to another object with a different color, this negative painting technique is your best bet. Simply paint around your object once you have a background color established. And of course this may not work if you have some high contrast color areas, but in most cases a slight blend works, especially with colors that are close on the spectrum, as in this case we have different greens, oranges, and yellows very close on the spectrum. So it works really well. Naturally, it works the best when you have a very dark background and you want to bring the focus to a few light elements like I'm doing here, the leaves and the flowers. You may have seen me use this trick on this white rose painting where I wanted to add some visual interest around the rose without taking the focus away from the flower. And so I used negative painting to create a few leaf shapes which stood out just a little bit from a darker background. And I will link this video in the description below in case you want to see it in detail. Notice too that I slowly transitioned my background color from this deep Perylene Green to Indothrone Blue up on top. You may remember this from my earlier tutorial on watercolor background techniques. And essentially the reason for this color switch is that I want to gently suggest a blue sky on top while the greenery stays at the bottom. And so this is why I'm adding a little bit of blue up on top. And of course, I screwed up a little bit towards the end, adding too much water on the bottom right. So to fix my mistake, I just added a bunch of warm Hooker's green there. So that's okay too. Sometimes you have to improvise. And the next layer of negative painting will help us clean that up a little bit more, making that large green blob of color look like it actually fit, like it's a leaf. Before I show you how I fixed it though, let me do a second layer of paint on the flowers. And I don't want to get too detailed there, but I do want to add more saturated oranges as I see them in the reference photo, perhaps a little bit of quinacridone coral, which is one of my favorite flowers. It will fit here next to this orange. So, and the reason why I want to do a little bit of work on the flowers is that I can use it as a reference for my greenery, just to help me decide how vibrant I want my greens to be. I certainly don't want them to clash with the flowers, so adding a few preliminary petals here and there will help me establish this sort of anchor, this color anchor, if you will. By the way, when you observe someone else paint, it's not always obvious why they may be jumping around from subject to subject instead of starting and finishing one layer at a time. But generally, I've learned this from editing my own videos and thinking more in depth about why I paint the way I paint. This is an important practice, as you're sort of always checking your values and your saturation level on different parts of the painting and on different objects. So it may look like I'm jumping around aimlessly, but it's actually to make adjustments and sort of keep myself in check and ensure that I'm following a cohesive palette and that everything looks according to the plan as I move towards building volume slowly, layer by layer. And now I'm going to let everything dry and paint the third layer of color, create some wonderful lighter details on the greenery using negative painting technique. And you will also see how this technique can help you take control of your color temperature and adjust the sunlight effect simply by glazing a warmer color around certain subjects and avoiding others. So our background greenery is fairly cold. There are some warmer leaves pointing up, and I'm going to go with my hooker's green and sometimes a little bit of green gold and glaze some of the areas, mostly in the middle, just to indicate some sunlight. Notice that our round leaves have light veins extending from the middle. We don't have a luxury of painting them with white or lighter watercolor pigment. Once something is dark with watercolors, it will remain dark. So how do we create these very light, thin veins? You could use masking fluid and cover them up, adding darker green on top and then erasing the masking fluid, but that's really time consuming, and a lot easier is to simply paint around them like I'm doing here, using different combinations of green. Notice too that I'm starting to use this approach on the flower stamens. The same idea applies here. We have very thin details. These stamens are yellow, very light. We can't paint them on top of the green background, but we can paint around them with green, outlining their silhouette with a tip of your brush. And suddenly the stems are there. And we will come back later to add a little bit more depth and color there, but you can see sort of the beginning of the flower shape emerge, and the stems are much more visible now. And now, instead of focusing on warmer areas and bringing my color temperature up with warmer greens, I'm going to do the opposite using negative painting technique. I'm going to focus more on the leaves that are in the shadow and also on the very back of our composition, those distant areas visible through the stems and leaves. If you recall my detailed explanation of color theory from the background video tutorial I did a couple of weeks ago, the blue pigments will always look like they're further away. So it's time to bring out my latest obsession, this pigment called Aqua Green from Winsor Newton, which is actually kind of a greenish blue. And you may recall I used a lot of it in that background video. By the way, I keep referring to it, so I think I'll link it in the video description below, and it will be a nice complement to this tutorial, and you can watch it right after to get a better sense of different background techniques and color choices that make sense for backgrounds. So anyway, I'm now going over the leaves that are in the shade and also those far away bits of background with this bluish green or greenish blue, occasionally mixing in some warm green gold highlights. And I'm basically painting and pushing those background areas, those darker areas, back visually by adding this cooler color. You can see even more now how the front facing leaves are starting to stand out, and the glow of the sun is getting more and more defined next to this colder blue-green area. I'm also adding a little bit of brown down at the bottom. After all, we may have some soil visible through the leaves, and I think it's appropriate to warm that area up, just suggesting the ground or maybe some dry leaves with this brown pigment. Okay, and now it's time to come back to our flowers like I promised, and used negative painting to finish off the stamens, the inside of each flower, those delicate little hairs inside each flower. I'm just going to paint around them, adjusting my greens as I go to match the background greenery that we've already painted the best I can, and I will finish off by adding a bit more definition on the petals, keeping the top flower super light and using more saturated yellows and oranges and corals on the flowers that are not facing the sun directly. Notice that I applied a purple shadow cast from the top flower to the bottom flowers, and I used the Axazine purple from Core. This is a deliberate choice because purple is complementary to orange, and we've explored this last week in the video about painting yellow and orange flowers. We talked about why purple is a good choice for shadow areas and how it works well with yellows and oranges based on color theory. So I will also leave that video link in the description if you want to learn a little bit more on that topic. But this is really a minor detail, and I think I will leave my flowers for now, let them dry. I may or may not come back later. I think they're getting very close to being finished. And now the final layer, I will use negative painting to create pretty defined veins on these two leaves that are facing us. And imagine how difficult it would be if I had to cover them with masking fluid and then erase. And I like masking fluid, but only if nothing else works, if I need to mask the white. If I can avoid it and replace it with a negative painting approach, I always do it that way. It just makes sense and saves a ton of time. Also, masking fluid is always a little bit risky because it may not come off properly. I recently had a bad experience with a new type of paper I tried, which was performing quite well. It was 100% cotton, 140 pounds, a little bit cheaper than Arches. But as soon as I tried putting masking fluid, I realized something was off because erasing it would literally peel off the layers of paper, and it was just a very disappointing experience. In any case, I will also add another layer of color for the background, and my goal here is to create the most contrast around the leaves that are closer to us, and maybe a bit up on top, the edge of light area as I call it. And my other goal is to add more contrast now because we're in the final stage of the painting. The edges are all very smooth, and I want to play around with contrast by building more value. In other words, going a few shades darker and more saturated on the background in the center. The more I do it, the more my flowers will stand out, and the more my lighter leaves will stand out. And here I'm no longer concerned about transparency. If I want to make some areas super dark and almost opaque, I will, but still trying to let those pigments that we put down in the first and the second layer shine through for the most part. And I hope I've convinced you that a negative painting technique can be quite useful and, at the very least, fun alternative to painting your objects inside. And so if you want to try painting them outside, I hope this gave you some good ideas. So definitely let me know if you have any questions. Try it out, have some fun with it, and I'll see you next week with a new watercolor tutorial.